Welcome to the Regulating Bitcoin track. It's no secret that there is growing interest in Bitcoin on Capitol Hill, and contrary to popular belief, Bitcoin is not an unregulated asset. As the next wave of participants adopt Bitcoin, it's imperative to continue to educate policymakers and advocate for sensible regulatory approaches to Bitcoin. As we'll discuss in this track, Bitcoin is an open network and in many ways doesn't need the government's permission to grow. But it still is important to discuss how Bitcoin policy fits into the larger legislative priorities, how it should be driven by the innovation of Bitcoin, and how to promote this innovation and regulatory clarity of Bitcoin in a thoughtful way.
Hello, everyone. I'm here with SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce. Thank you so much for joining us for this.
Pomp, it's great to be here. I have to, of course, start with my disclaimer that the views that I represent are my own views, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your views. You've been very vocal about some of your views around crypto. And I think one of the big questions that everyone has right now is crypto is one of many things that a regulator like the SEC is focused on. Can you help us just get kind of a level set in terms of the importance of crypto in the body of work that you and your fellow commissioners do on a day-to-day basis, and kind of how you view, the maybe crypto versus traditional financial markets or anything else you may be focused on?
So, I mean, that's a great question to start with, just because I think sometimes people in the crypto space think that we spend all of our time thinking about crypto. In reality, it's a quite small sliver of what we do. I mean, regulating the capital, we're one of two regulators of the capital markets at the federal level in the United States. And so you've got a huge swath of things to spend time on. Now, that said, I think as crypto has gotten more attention from retail investors and institutional investors, and just from the mainstream media and from politicians, we're spending more time thinking about it. And I would argue we're probably spending a disproportionate amount of time given the size of the asset class. Although, that said, I think there's some unique and interesting regulatory issues that we do have to get worked out, and it would be better to do that earlier rather than later. Now, our new chair, Chair Gensler, has come in, and I think when any new chairman comes into the SEC, he brings a big package of agenda items that he wants to work out and work on, have the staff work on. So he's working on getting that agenda going. I think crypto will be part of it, but it was not part of the initial regulatory agenda that his office put out, that the SEC put out earlier this year. So I'm hopeful that we can get crypto onto that agenda.
Got it. And so would it be fair to read into the idea that not having crypto on the agenda means that it's just not a focus? Or is there some other way for us to kind of look at whether it is listed or it's not listed on that agenda? How should people kind of take away how the SEC or some of the individual commissioners view crypto as an industry compared to those other things that you guys are focused on?
Well, I think one thing to bear in mind is that the regulatory agenda really does deal with rules. So it's a question of are we working on a rule that relates directly to crypto? And it wasn't on the list of rules. That doesn't mean that there's not work going on in other parts of the commission. So, of course, in enforcement, there could well be work going on related to crypto. There certainly has been in the past. And then we also have a FinHub, which is an office that deals with innovation of all kinds, financial technology of all kinds. And the staff in that office are spending quite a bit of their time dealing with crypto issues and working with international regulators and other regulators at the federal level here in the United States, and trying to do outreach with innovators themselves who are working in crypto. So there's a lot going on there. Now, I think every commissioner has his or her own set of priorities. And I think, I'd like to get my fellow commissioners spend a bit more time thinking about crypto, so that we could do something sort of constructive in this space to provide more clarity, which is what I think is really needed.
I'm a little shy to ask the question this way, but if you were to kind of think through or speculate on maybe some of the other commissioners and their viewpoint on crypto, the fact that they're not spending maybe as much time as you are, is that something because the industry is smaller? Maybe there's not as many of the large institutions on Wall Street that have been participating historically. Is it just not a personal interest? Like, what do you think is kind of driving maybe the lack of interest or the lack of attention to it versus maybe some of the other issues on the agenda?
Well, and I certainly don't want to speak for my fellow commissioners, and they're all very knowledgeable about a whole range of issues, and I think they're all interested in, based on things I've heard them say publicly. I think they're all interested in crypto issues. So I don't want to suggest otherwise. I just think that there are a lot of really pressing issues on everyone's agenda. For example, I'm thinking a lot about how does the economy come out of COVID-19 and reopen, and how do businesses that really struggled to make it through that period, how do they keep their doors open and grow and get their clientele back? So that's something that's really on my mind. And everyone has different, the former acting Chair Lee, has spent a lot of time thinking about climate change. So everyone has different issues, but I think people, especially as the asset class has grown, people are spending more time thinking about it here at the commission.
Got it. One of the topics that definitely is top of mind for people in the crypto industry is the Bitcoin ETF. There's been a slew of various applications that have been put in over the last kind of 6 to 9 months, and the SEC has continued to kind of push forward those applications and kind of not make a decision or delay the decisions or outright reject some of them. Any color or insight that you could provide on the ETF situation, and maybe some more elaboration on your recent comments that, in your opinion, it sounds like the ETF should have been approved a while ago, and the argument against it is kind of fading away?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that I would never have imagined that I would be in this situation where we would not yet have approved one, and other countries are moving ahead. We now have a good example in Canada, which not only has a Bitcoin ETF, but also one based on Ether. And so I think we can take lessons from the experiences that foreign countries have had. Obviously, our regulatory structure is different here, and so we have to apply our own set of rules. But as I laid out in my initial dissent on the first Bitcoin exchange traded product that I thought we should have approved, I mean, I think we are applying a different set of standards to this asset, to this type of exchange traded product than we have to other similar types of exchange traded products. Um, I think the staff is, they've laid out in their disapprovals some of the things that they're looking at, and they are working hard to, and working with people in the industry who are trying to get these things approved. They're sorting through data and looking at the data from different angles. But the industry has matured quite a bit, and as you have more institutional players involved, there's a natural maturing of the industry that I think has addressed some of the concerns that were underneath the initial disapproval. So I'm certainly hopeful that we can recognize that there is that maturity there, and also the fact that there's a lot happening. People are looking for other ways to get access to Bitcoin, and my question is, wouldn't we rather have an option for people to access it through our regulated markets? I think a lot of people in the Bitcoin world might prefer that we didn't, but I think it's typical for us to at least want to have that option out there for people, if people want it, and then the products can survive or not survive depending on whether there's investor demand.
Yeah, I've always been very interested how much it matters the investors that are seeking exposure to Bitcoin via maybe other listed or traded products. So there's some other trust type products out there. There's public companies now that are starting to put it on their balance sheet, and some investors are buying the stocks, it appears, for exposure there. Does that have any kind of play into the decisions that are made internally at the regulatory body? Or how should people think about seeing an increase in what appears to be demand for exposure to the asset and the ETF decision? Is there any relationship there?
Well, it's certainly a relationship that I see, and I mean, I think we have to ask that question: Are retail investors being served well by not having this option? But I think one of the problems with the way the SEC operates is it sometimes thinks in a very, and this isn't limited just to crypto, but it sometimes thinks in a very one-off way. And so, when I'm thinking about should a product, we're not a merit regulator, so we don't shouldn't be in the business of deciding whether something is good or bad. But an investor is thinking of the investor's entire portfolio, and sometimes we're thinking just in one-off terms, a particular product standing on its own, and we forget that people, are building portfolios. And so that, I think, sometimes makes it harder for us to look outside of the application that we're looking at and to see what else is going on. In this case, what else is going on is that there are other products that are sort of substitute exchange traded products, whether it's a company that has a lot of Bitcoin in its treasury, or whether it's another kind of product that's not available on exchanges, but is available in some other way. And I think we do need to take that broader context into account.
You mentioned earlier that other countries may be kind of moving forward at a faster pace, introducing products that the U.S. has not yet approved or introduced. There's definitely countries in North America, so Canada being the great example. We also see some movement in South America and then also in Europe. But the Asian region seems to be the one that people constantly pit the West versus the East. Any thoughts or kind of insights into what's been going on in China or some of the Asian markets and their kind of relationship with crypto, which frankly has been somewhat volatile. It seems like at some points they've embraced it, at other times they've really said, "Hey, we don't want Bitcoin here. We don't want Bitcoin mining here." And so, how do you view that situation, and does that play into it all? How you kind of evaluate Bitcoin and the regulatory environment here in the United States?
Well, we always have something to learn from how other people handle these kinds of things, these kinds of innovations. Whether that's a positive lesson or a negative lesson depends. And so I think we're always kind of watching. I'm concerned, of course. I want us to be the place where everyone wants to come to both innovate and invest. And so I want us to have the best set of rules, just because we do have the deepest and best capital markets in the world. And I think we should pair that with being the most welcoming to innovation. I think it's sometimes harder for a big market like this, and one that has really established rules, to turn on a dime and um, do something new. But we certainly have something to learn from places like Singapore. I think that have been a bit more forward thinking, and as you mentioned, Europe, I think, has been more forward thinking in some ways as well. I think what a lot of people are asking me for is just clarity. Give us clarity around what we can and can't do, whether that's around custody or around exchange traded products, or around the broader crypto questions about whether something is or is not being sold as a security.
Yeah, what's fascinating to me, I think, is when we start thinking about innovation. Regulation is a component of that. So is taxes. So is just the pure entrepreneurship, the investment that happens in these markets. One of the key differences in the market, let's say in kind of Bitcoin and the broader industry versus the traditional Wall Street world, is this asset trades 24/7, 365. There's an element of decentralization to it. And so, is it fair to ask regulators to evaluate what appears to be a different type of asset with some key different criteria to it with the same framework that they would look at a traditional asset? Or does it not really matter and it's just a financial asset? And you think that the same frameworks that we've always used kind of continue to apply here with an asset like Bitcoin?
Well, I think with exchange traded products, you can really build them with very different underlyings. And that's one of my areas of disagreement with my colleagues. I mean, they're looking below the exchange traded product and they're looking to the Bitcoin markets and they're saying, whoa, these markets look really different than the markets we're used to regulating. But I mean, certainly that's true with the gold markets too. Those aren't regulated in the same way the securities markets are. And so I think the beauty of exchange traded products is that you can take an asset that may trade very differently from our equities, and you can put it into a form that allows people to trade it in the accounts that they have alongside their equity portfolios. And I think that's a really valuable characteristic. That's why exchange traded products have been so successful.
We're talking here, based on your public comments at least, I think that you tend to be kind of more sympathetic to the Bitcoin view of the world in terms of what the Bitcoin community would like to see kind of happen in the United States and in the regulatory regime. Do you worry at all that if there's overregulation or we're kind of slow to accept some of this, that there's kind of a doomsday scenario or a negative situation where the U.S. falls either one, too far behind, or two, we lose some sort of strategic advantage? Or is it a thing where just, we are the financial capital of the world? And so even if we're a little slow, you're optimistic that we can kind of catch up once we decide to go ahead and move forward and check all the boxes that regulators are looking for.
I mean, I always worry about us falling behind. I think we can't rest on our laurels. We are, we've got great markets here and we've got great innovators here. But part of the reason I wanted to be part of the commission was that I think we don't always handle innovation well. And the idea of being a place where people want to come and build things and do interesting things, that's really important. That's sort of the core of who we are as a country. We're a place where people try new things and they build interesting things, and that should always be what people think of when they think of the United States. I think it can be easy for a country like ours to become very focused on the rules and on making sure that everything happens and no one gets hurt. And of course, that's a role that we as regulators play. We try to protect investors and prevent them from getting hurt. But I think one of the pieces of preventing investors from getting hurt is making sure that they have access to the full range of opportunities. You do actually hurt investors when you withhold opportunities from them. So I certainly do worry about that, and I certainly worry that there's some worrying statements, I think, coming out of DC around the idea that it's sort of the government's place to say yes, as opposed to people doing things. And then as the government looks at that, we try to put sensible regulations in place that allow people to make the choices they want to make and just build sensible protections around that. I really do think we have to bear in mind that the government is there to serve the people. And that's something that it's very easy for someone in a regulator's chair to sometimes forget.
Yeah, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what it sounds like you're basically saying is there is a view of the world, whether it's correct or not. If there's problems and a potential solution is out there and folks don't have access to it, then that in some way would be hurting them as well. And so it's very dependent on almost the perspective that you take. But it sounds like your view really comes from a just give people access to kind of all rational options. And then allow them the choice to make as to kind of how to allocate their portfolio.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly the right way to look at things. We do, we should view it as trying to give people the widest range of options possible. We have rules that we are going to apply, and we should apply them, fairly and equally across the board. And I should say, at the same time, if we're going to have this more open perspective, people need to be careful when they make decisions about what to buy, what to put in their portfolio. They need to be thinking about it and realizing that you can lose money. And that's a message I always try to give to people is, when you use your money to buy anything, you need to be careful and think about whether it's money you can afford to lose, and think about your risk tolerance, think about your other needs. So that's it, with freedom, of course, comes responsibility.
So hearing you say that as a SEC commissioner makes sense, I think, to a lot of folks who come from the financial world, who are pretty well versed in investing. But we've seen a recent surge in interest in young people in investing in various markets, not just in Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, but also in the stock market, et cetera. How does financial education play into this? And if you even kind of take it further into like accreditation laws and stuff like that, just how do you think through what is the responsibility of kind of the market participants versus maybe a regulatory body versus our school systems or anything like that around financial education?
Well, I think no one would argue against having more financial education in the schools. I think I'd love to see kids starting much younger, getting to know about the financial system, about opportunities in the financial markets to build their retirement portfolios and so forth, but also about opportunities for them to participate in that sector. I think it's wonderful that retail investors are showing an interest in participating in the equity markets. Of course, they have to be careful, and of course, they have to realize that they can lose money. And so that needs to be part of what the investor education is out there. We do have a website, investor.gov, that people can go to, and that has lots of good information on there. But what I think that we've done wrong at the SEC is that we've taken the view that maybe we should stand in for investors and make some decisions for them. And that's where you get rules like the accredited investor rules that say, you know what, if you're not wealthy, we're going to assume that you're not sophisticated and that you can't make these investment decisions for yourselves. I'd like to see us be much more willing to let people prove that they have taken that community college course that enables them to make wise decisions, or that they've taken other steps that indicate that they're ready and interested to invest in the markets, in the private markets. And so I would love us to have a much more open door approach. I think there's something really un-American about telling people, no, we've decided that you can't participate in these particular markets. That said, I also get a lot of people who, when they do lose money, they come to me and they say, well, wait, I lost money and I want you to do something about it. And so my message is always two-sided. It's, hey, I want the door to be open for you to do with your hard-earned money what you want to do. But at the same time, if you make a mistake, take that as a learning experience for the next time, and really do your research and make sure that you know what you're getting into. So it's kind of a two-sided thing, but I really think the SEC needs to be careful to avoid falling into the trap of becoming a merit regulator, because we as regulators can't know what's best for every American.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear you do this. 'Cause really, what it's talking about is almost a merit-based test, right? If you can pass a test, whatever that ends up being, whatever the education needed to get to that point. But if you're able to prove that you're educated, you understand risk, you should be allowed to participate in the market just like anybody else. Is that a fair kind of qualification of how you think about it?
Well, I mean, I've been pretty open about the fact that I think the accredited investor approach, having that standard in place, is not a great standard. I don't think that people should have to prove things to us, but I'm also a realist. And in Washington, I think there are not that many people who think the way I do, but I think we should think about careful ways to open the door, which would not only be good from my perspective, but I think would be acceptable to other regulators in DC, to say, look, we understand you have these investor protection concerns, and so here's a way we can address those concerns. I tend to be much more of the view that, people should be able to make their own decisions with their hard-earned money, but I don't think we're likely to go there anytime soon.
I unfortunately agree with you. We were talking earlier about kind of the individual investor or the retail market and their relationship with Bitcoin. There's also been obviously corporations that have started to enter into the space, and some of them are building products in the Bitcoin market and kind of driving revenue through it. Others are creating financial products that folks can invest into, but some of them are just buying Bitcoin themselves and putting it in their treasury. How do you think about kind of the actual purchasing of Bitcoin by corporations and putting that on their treasury? That's something that 12 months ago, if we were having this conversation, hadn't happened yet in the public market. And so, is that something that the SEC is looking at? Does that seem to be just kind of a normal practice of companies being able to put whatever they want in their treasury around financial assets, or just how do you see that?
Well, I'm going to fall back on what I was saying before. I'm not a believer in merit regulation, and so I don't think we should tell companies how to run themselves. I do think that we have a role to play in making sure that investors are getting good disclosures, and so making sure that companies are telling investors what they're doing. Um, and so, to me, that's what it really comes down to. Are you being upfront with investors about what your plan is and what you're doing? But I don't want to get in the business of running companies.
Along those lines, I think a lot about the adoption of Bitcoin being kind of the individual and then organizations, so both financial institutions and corporations, and then the kind of that last bucket of adoption really being nation states or central banks. A few weeks ago, obviously, El Salvador came out and spoke about making Bitcoin legal tender. Not necessarily what is your thought in terms of that country's decision, but how do you see just nation states in general, kind of these larger bodies or larger organizations starting to play in the market? Does that change the way that a regulatory body inside the United States looks at the asset? Or do you kind of fall back still to just it shouldn't really matter necessarily what other people are doing? The asset is the asset, and we should just underwrite that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it's our um, place to really judge that kind of thing. But again, I think it just plays into if you have institutions and nations using an asset, it's likely that the markets for that asset are going to become more mature. And I think that then plays into answering some of the questions that the staff had, for example, in considering these Bitcoin exchange traded products. So I think that's where it sort of intersects with what we do at the SEC.
Got it. And then the last question I have for you is just around how folks who are either listening to this or folks in the private market, corporations, or financial institutions, how can they help the SEC, whether it's from an education perspective or actions that they take, or how do you see them kind of interfacing or interacting with you and the rest of your fellow commissioners?
Well, I certainly love it when people come and talk to me. I am always in need of learning more, and so I appreciate people who are willing to take the time to educate me. And I think that that's true of my colleagues too, both on the commission and on the staff. It's always helpful to get education from people who are spending all of their time in this industry. So please do inform us, educate us. I know it can be time consuming, but we really do greatly appreciate that. And I think that will help us to be better regulators of the space. Unfortunately, as we started out talking about, we do lots of different things. And so it can be really easy to fall prey to just reading the headlines. And the headlines on this topic are often not positive headlines. And so, make sure that you're giving us the rest of the story, and that you're telling us the really exciting things that are happening in this space too. I think sometimes it's so easy to focus on the negative, that we forget the really positive um, possibilities and realities around crypto.
There were many bad things said about the internet 20, 25 years ago. So that turned out okay. I think that hopefully the narrative will change over time. What would be your best suggestion for folks who do want to reach out, help educate you or your colleagues? Where can they do this? Or a website that you want to send them to, or some other destination?
Well, if they want to talk to the staff, they should go through FinHub. There's a page on our website that provides contact info for FinHub, and then come to me, Commissioner Peirce at sec.gov. I really do welcome the chance to talk to people, so please take me up on that.
Awesome. Well, Commissioner, thank you so much for your time today. I think most people in the Bitcoin community really appreciate your kind of rational view of the world and your constant kind of advocacy for the view of having Bitcoin treated as the rest of the financial assets are. And so we will definitely have to continue to watch as you continue your work.
Thanks so much, Pomp. I really enjoyed this.
Hi, welcome to the second panel of the Regulating Bitcoin track. I'm going to be your moderator for this panel discussion. I'm Peter Van Valkenburgh. I'm the Director of Research at Coin Center. Coin Center is the leading nonprofit researching and advocating the policy issues that affect Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. I have an incredible panel with me today to discuss. We were actually joking right before we started this that you've just heard, hopefully, a very energetic discussion about securities law. We're going to be discussing anti-money laundering policy, which it may surprise some of you to know, there are actually a lot more simple answers in this space, maybe because of some excellent and well-earned regulatory clarity in this space. So I don't know, maybe we'll send a couple volleys over to Commissioner Peirce's way throughout the panel. But yes, we have some great experts. So joining me today is Mike Mosier. Mike is the acting director of FinCEN. Formerly, he was the deputy director at FinCEN and FinCEN's first digital innovation officer, focusing on emergent technologies like cryptocurrencies. FinCEN, for those of you who don't know, is the agency in the US that sets policy as far as anti-money laundering is concerned. It's a part of Treasury. Before that, he was chief technical counsel at Chainalysis, the blockchain analysis firm. So obviously, you can see Mike's credentials in this space are pretty great. And joining me is also Jay Ramaswamy, who's head of risk compliance and regulatory policy at C Labs. They are the developers of, or they are some of the developers of the Celo protocol. Previously, he was head of risk management at Capital One. Before that, he was head of AML compliance at Bank of America. And he was also at the Justice Department for over a decade, most recently as the chief of the asset forfeiture and money laundering section in the criminal division. Again, pretty sterling credentials. So with that, high expectations, guys, for a good conversation, but I think we'll just jump right in. So for those of you who are not maybe intimately familiar with what FinCEN has done in this space and how anti-money laundering policy has evolved with crypto, you may be surprised that we've had pretty clear guidance since 2013. This is not a new area for policy. So I want to start out with sort of let's ignore the past for a bit and come right to the present. And I want to ask both of you to sort of give me what you think is the largest challenge that AML policy in the US faces right now with respect to crypto. Where is the biggest gap in our ability to address the flow of criminal monies through these networks and regulating businesses in a reasonable way for anti-money laundering purposes? Maybe we'll start with Mike.
Sure. Thanks, Peter. Great to be here with y'all. And yeah, I think that's actually a great first question, particularly to not look at the past. And I think I'd start by saying, money laundering's constantly evolving, so it's a very moving target. And I also don't want to overstate any sense of gaps in coverage because, as you noted, I think FinCEN's regulations are designed to be principles-based and technology neutral. And the point of that is to remain flexible for changes, both in the financial technology, but also in money laundering. So I don't see a lot of major gaps in the application, but they're, in interpretation and sort of how people apply things. There's spaces where that we'd like to do more. I think as a really more globally than domestically is our concern. So I think to that, our biggest concern right now is really with poorly regulated foreign exchanges that allow for the cash out of illicitly obtained cryptocurrencies. We're really not seeing a lot of that cashing out happening in the US side. The US exchanges, not surprisingly, have pretty strong AML programs and financial integrity, looking at risk-based approaches, like we've said since 2013. But what we see is, and this happens in the ransomware space, which is getting a lot of attention right now, is that the AML implementation globally is pretty uneven. There's regulatory arbitrage, and so it allows for that cash out of illicitly obtained crypto. And I know I think folks will at some point will point to disintermediation as sort of the other potential or emerging gap. I think from what we're seeing, that's still not the illicit finance risk that maybe it will be someday. At this point, criminals are still cashing out, and that's really with the foreign exchanges and the regulatory arbitrage. And from FinCEN's perspective, we've been very clear since 2013, but then clarified in our 2019 guidance that software developers, if they're not transmitting value, are not money transmitters, and that's not sort of the risk that we're seeing just yet.
Right. So it's not so much at the moment a problem where we're seeing a lot of illicit use of, say, DeFi or things like that. The key issue seems to be these non-compliant foreign exchanges. Do American laws apply to these foreign entities?
Well, that's a jurisdictional question, and I'll defer to the chief of the money laundering section, Jay, and judges. But certainly personal and commercial jurisdiction for purposely availing yourselves of the U.S. jurisdiction, there's certainly applicability to there. Yeah.
Jay, do you want to riff on that?
Sure. Look, it's really a pleasure to be on the panel, especially with Michael, who I've known for years and a real star in this area. And it's great to hear Michael's perspective on where U.S. regulation is, and I would sort of second what he said. Obviously, he has more authority than I do in this space, but FinCEN's approach of financial intermediary regulation has been the approach that both the U.S. and global standard-setting bodies have taken for years. It seems to be the right approach here, and I think the gaps are inconsistent application across the globe. And so, how do we attach that? I'll just make a quick comment. I'm no longer chief of the asset forfeiture money laundering section, but as you can imagine, with most financial transactions have a dollar nexus of some sort, and so the jurisdiction that U.S. enforcers have globally under the anti-money laundering laws is very, and money laundering laws directly, is substantial. The jurisdiction over also potential asset forfeiture matters is so when they want to recover assets is pretty broad. And so what I would say is that you've seen examples of U.S. authorities exercising extraterritorial jurisdiction pretty aggressively and being supported by the courts. So I wouldn't take any comfort, I guess, if I were a foreign money launderer by being in a foreign jurisdiction if I have a nexus to the U.S. financial system.
I mean, I suppose the thing that kept coming to my mind was the BTCE enforcement action, which is probably one of the more recent ones. I think that was joint FinCEN DOJ actually.
Yeah, I believe it was.
Yeah, which was, of course, Alexander Vinnick was running this exchange that was usually the final destination for ransomware payments at the time, and that was a pretty successful enforcement action where they were able to get him, which is a good news story. So I guess let's now come back home from abroad and talk just about the exchanges, the custodial exchanges in the US who are regulated. And as I said, we've had clear guidance about this question, like what are your obligations as a custodial exchange? Since 2013 from FinCEN, you have to know your customers, you have to do suspicious activity reporting, all these things. Are we at a good place right now with the particular AML requirements that we're putting on custodial exchanges? Or do we need more information? Or do we need different requirements than we are already placing on regular old money transmitters and custodial exchanges? The thing that's triggering this question for me is the still pending rulemaking. So maybe, Mike, I don't know how much you can talk about it and how much you can't, but the still pending rulemaking that started last December, which asked for additional reports in the form of currency transaction reports for crypto, and maybe even special record-keeping rules. And counterparty identification was something that was controversial there. Coin Center filed multiple comments. But the process has been, to my mind, actually very fair and transparent since that rulemaking started and the comment period was extended. Where are we? Do we get the information we need from exchanges, Mike?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, like you noted, I think you're referencing an open rulemaking that was driven by former Secretary Mnuchin on currency transaction report like requirements, and those are requirements that already apply to the fiat world. They just have not applied to cryptocurrency. So to some degree, there is a gap there that's been identified, and I think it doesn't make it automatic that the gap has to be closed or it has to be done so in a particular way. But it is worth, I think, upfront acknowledging the gap, and then also that I have to be very careful. I don't want to get ahead of a deliberative process on an open rulemaking. But just to say that I think in general, and speaking about these, there was nothing automatic about it, and that's why there were multiple extensions of time for notice and comment to hear from the public, both about the costs and benefits of it, but also potential other ways of addressing the risks that were articulated. And we've actively welcomed, including in lots of different engagements, other ways to address the risks that were articulated. And that might include technical solutions that would reduce or even possibly obviate the need for additional regulation. I think part of the appeal of this innovation of cryptocurrency is making the most of the transparency of it, and that also protects privacy. And so, it's not just slotting everything into the fiat world, but I think, even with the departure of Secretary Mnuchin, there's a risk articulated that folks want to be addressing. And so I think the idea is to be working with industry in a very principles-driven way, and making the most of the sort of innovation here, and address those risks before there's some sort of high-impact event that suddenly calls Congress or others to sort of call for really broad, rushed action. But we want to keep everything as flexible as possible. That's going to allow for the innovative resilience of the U.S. system, for sure.
And Jay, you've written about how these technologies behave. They behave rather like cash, and we should maybe treat them like cash. How do you feel about, so this currency transaction report requirement is, in the normal banking context, it's if you withdraw $10,000 or more in cash or monetary instruments. I'm not telling you that, you know that quite well, but for our audience, it seems like it would make sense if Bitcoin or things like that are electronic cash, that the same reporting requirements would apply. But of course they don't, because of a quirk in the way that we've defined monetary instruments in the past. Do you think that this is a sensible requirement, and what are the risks? And also, to Mike's point, can we do something different and better instead of maybe having just mass reporting of customer information to the government?
Yeah, look, I think that you have to always look at the attributes of the specific channel that you're talking about in trying to figure out what the most effective way of attacking money laundering is. And at the heart of the Bank Secrecy Act, at the heart of, I know, the work that Michael is neck deep in right now through the AMLA, effectiveness is the touchstone. We don't want indiscriminate reporting over useless information that just creates problems. Law enforcement doesn't want it. FinCEN doesn't want it. Nobody wants it. And so the question is, how do you get effective information that's going to actually target bad actors and lead to better outcomes? And so I start from that premise. And if you do start from that premise, where we stand today, most of the fields that would be obtainable through a CTR are available on-chain in your typical transparent blockchain protocol. It's not true across the board, but at least in those systems. And so I think it's just a question of asking, are you going to get more effective information than you already have currently through the existing financial intermediary regulation, and then what's available publicly on the blockchain?
That's a striking statement. Sorry to interrupt, but if all of that information is publicly available, isn't that actually kind of a problem with the way these technologies are built? That information is pretty private and sensitive. And we were asking banks to, privately report that to government. The fact that it's publicly displayed actually seems more like a consumer privacy issue than a boon to anti-money laundering policy.
Yeah, and look, I think this is a tension that we're going to see more and more of as we move to central bank digital currencies, the digital dollar discussions of what the right architecture for our future financial system should be, which is that the world we used to live in was a world of siloed data and a default of privacy. Whether that was privacy through internal controls at financial institutions or other mechanisms, the default was privacy, not transparency.
Right.
When you move to a world where the default is transparency, the risks change in some senses, and you have to start recalibrating what are the cybersecurity risks, what are the risks from competition and corporate espionage, insider trading, or other types of activity. And I think that recalibration is going to take place regulatorily, but it'll also take place technologically, because I think you're going to see a demand, and we're seeing this in the market where legitimate people are concerned that if I pay you with my Bitcoin wallet or with my Celo wallet, in our case, I all of a sudden, if I just use a block explorer, can figure out your net worth and everything else that you have there. And that's kind of dangerous. And so you have a push, if you will, a demand side push for privacy enhancing technologies to try to accomplish what we had before. But that runs counter to some of the advantages of the blockchain from a money laundering perspective. And this is where I think the shout out that Michael gave to the developments in the industry and what this technology can potentially do is really important. We need to incentivize the creation of solutions that can take advantage of some of the unique attributes of cryptographic technology, whether it's homomorphic encryption, zero knowledge proofs, to maybe square this circle and do it in a better way so that we're not relying solely on the controls that exist within an institution, but we can do it mathematically and cryptographically and have selective disclosures as required. I'm not an engineer. I couldn't tell you how this is going to be done, but I know that there are really smart companies working on this right now. And to have regulatory certainty about which of these solutions would be permissible under for a financial institution to use under existing regulations would go a long way in incentivizing the creation of innovative technologies. At the end of the day, these are smart contracts, and we've always focused on the at least in Ethereum-based systems, they're smart contract and arguably and potentially layer 2 solutions as well elsewhere. But we've always focused on the commercial applications, and I think there's room here for regulatory applications of smart contract technology. But there needs to be, I think, a little bit more development, both within the space technologically and in terms of regulatory certainty about what's permissible. So
I think you're right, because the worst case scenario is in some ways a naive application of some of the reporting requirements and a naive usage of the technology. If you have a plain vanilla Bitcoin transaction from an exchange to an individual, and the reporting requirement requires the exchange learn the name and physical address of the individual, which was one of the things proposed in the recent rulemaking, government will be compiling a list of names and physical addresses matched to Bitcoin addresses, which is sort of a golden treasure map to who you can find who owns a lot of Bitcoin according to the blockchain, where they live, and how you can extort them, basically. This is one of the main concerns of, I think, that rulemaking. Mike, when it comes to learning and finding these new technological alternatives, which could be better both for law enforcement and for regulators and also for the privacy of consumers, where do we stand with education within these agencies? Like homomorphic encryption and zero knowledge proofs is scary to me as a technology focused lawyer, but as to someone who's just a more general lawyer, it's like, oh gosh, this is like, I'm in contracts 101 all over again, and I'm terrified about whether I'm going to make it to 2L year, right?
We'll get you consideration, Peter. Meeting of the minds, cryptographically. Yeah, it's actually one of the most fun parts of the job right now is the ability to gather people and have these conversations. In fact, one of the things I did recently that you were a part of, and others, and lots of others have been a part of, is bringing people in to educate. Jay's talked to us a lot of different times too. I mean, he bridges all these worlds. Like every one of them, law enforcement, traditional banking, crypto banking, platforms, software development, it's sort of everything. And so we're having conversations constantly. And it's actually been amazing. And I think there's a couple points on that. One, the turnout has been phenomenal, all the way across, not just FinCEN, but Treasury, including the White House, people that would come in for these conversations, because I think people see we've been struggling with policy issues for decades, and now there's this technology that has a social component and a privacy component, but also a computational component that may be able to address so many different things. And so there's actually a lot of excitement there. And we've brought in core developers from privacy technology, not for backdoors, but just to have conversations about how they can do great things with this technology, and even just how they all do it a little bit differently. I think even just having that conversation is really illuminating to say, well, how are you different from these guys over here? Not just from a commercial standpoint, but like what makes it better, and what are the trade-offs you've made, so that we're thinking through what's possible. And then we set up an innovation hours program that we had a call for everyone to come in. We do a monthly day where people come in and talk about technology innovations with us, that we can give feedback for the clarity that they need, but also so that we can get educated. It's for both of those things. And we set one up specifically on privacy technology to encourage people who are building privacy principles into their AML thinking to come in, and we'll talk through exactly what you mentioned, Peter and Jay, both, like that you need a measure of certainty that this is going to work, and this is what people are looking for, because we know people aren't going to adopt it. Frankly, even if FinCEN is okay with it, if they feel like other regulators that might be in the space aren't going to be. And so we're having those conversations, including discussing, we don't call them sandboxes, but we do a lot of pilot programs as much as our resources can handle and people are interested in doing. And that's part of that, is to have that sort of certainty that people can have to go out and try things. Because for us too, if it's a technical solution to a policy problem, that's good for everybody. And that's where we want to be. We want to be protecting privacy, which is a fundamental principle of American founding, the Constitution, along with the right for self-determination, for liberty to flourish, to not have violence done upon you. And so the idea is to put all of this together. And I think that's the exciting part with this technology that's leading to a lot of great education and conversations.
And I will say that when we've participated in those conversations, which for some of them we have, they've been remarkably two-sided conversations, which is not always the case when you go meet with a person in a position of power in the government from a regulatory standpoint. It's often you're saying a lot, and there's sort of just a lot of listening going on the other side, which starts to make you feel uneasy after a while. But in this case, that has not been our experience. At least we're really grateful that FinCEN has taken such an approach where they want to learn, but they also want to share their perspective. Maybe that's my one volley against Hester Peirce there is, no, I'm not going to say anything. So with the last 10 minutes or so, I want to turn to international policy. And, this is a hard area because we've got all these sovereign nations that have different anti-money laundering rules. And we try to reach for harmony, both in the interest of businesses that are global by default, because it's the internet, of course, being able to operate without having 25 different standards or 250 different standards, and also in the interests of tracking down, money laundering, which is, of course, more often than not, I'd say, a global phenomena. There is this organization that some of the listeners may have heard of. Of course, both of you know it fairly well, the Financial Action Task Force, which plays a sort of a role of congregating money laundering authorities from various countries and getting them to reach consensus over what should be general standards for all the member nations. FATF, I think, had really good guidance on this stuff back in 2019, and I don't think it's any surprise that the US had the presidency back then, and the FATF guidance mirrored a lot of the good policy that was developed at FinCEN at that point. There's new draft guidance that's been proposed as of last spring, and I know Coin Center has some concerns, but I want to let you guys talk about where you see, things that might be good or things that might be bad in that new draft guidance. Maybe because we've been starting with Mike most times, we'll start with Jay this time.
Sure. Look, I think it's always good to start with positive things. And so the positive thing about the FATF guidance is, for the first time, you have an international body thinking really carefully, I think, about how do you regulate open source platforms that really are accessible to everybody on a global basis, and come up with some baseline that everybody can agree on, all countries can agree on. And I think that's not an easy thing, having been involved in some of these discussions. Michael has been involved in more of them. I mean, try to get a few lawyers to agree, let alone lawyers from different countries to agree. It's like herding cats. And so, hats off to them for putting together something that's trying to address a real problem that we discussed, I think, in the first question you asked around regulatory Where I think that the guidance, the recent guidance, the proposed guidance, I should say, went off, I think, on a tangent a little bit was in coming up with a definition of a financial intermediary, a VASP, that was in trying to encompass a technology or aspects of the technology that are specifically about financial disintermediation. And in trying to expand the definition of what a financial intermediary for cryptocurrency purposes is, raises a whole host of practical issues because ultimately, as Michael was saying before, none of the money laundering laws are meant to apply to software development. And what you're seeing is in kind of the moniker that's taken root is software is eating the world. Protocols are eating the world as they have in different parts. And what do you do in that situation? And my own view is that the better approach is to think about, as we discussed before, blockchain native solutions that are going to technologically potentially address these problems, trying to figure out what risks arise that are new when counterparty risks and financial intermediary risks start disappearing. So that rather than trying to make everybody a financial intermediary, which is, it's a crude way of putting it, probably unfair, but it's kind of what happens in the FATF guidance. We need to start thinking differently about the specific risks associated with the technology. What are the mitigating factors and where are the actual gaps that exist? And that's really hard work to do. So I think that the approach of trying to, and the guidance didn't do this, but it sort of gave cover to countries that might want to ban or prohibit the technology, which is really not feasibly possible.
Probably counterproductive, right? You know,
it's counterproductive most certainly, but it's also probably not possible because it's open source technology. And so all you do is drive it to the shadows. And so I think FATF has also been open to an incredibly constructive dialogue, and I hope they're open to more of a dialogue on this. All the national delegations have been open to it. But having said that, you see different jurisdictions taking pretty draconian steps in terms of trying to divorce, if you will, crypto from the financial system, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's more recently in China. There's some rumors out of Europe as to what the new AML law is going to be coming out of Europe and might ban certain types of anonymous transactions. And so there is a push to do this. And in reality, money laundering is going to be better served when there's more connectivity between peer-to-peer transactions and centralized transactions. There's more visibility. There's a cultural push to compliance when that happens. You divorce these two worlds and you push it into the shadows, and you're more likely to get the rise of the equivalent of the black market peso exchange, the equivalent of hawalas. I
want to get to Mike. So we're coming up towards the end of that half hour. So Mike, I feel like U.S. anti-money laundering policy grew up in the shadow of the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment of our Constitution, and it got internationalized by organizations like FATF in a large part. But now FATF might be driven by nations that don't have those kinds of constitutional limitations, and they might want to extend these rule sets to people who aren't intermediaries, to people who might have a vested right of privacy. How does FinCEN play this role between an international organization and their obligations under the Constitution?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think, first of all, every single thing Jay said made so much sense and resonated that he sort of very helpfully framed what my answer is going to be, which is that we have to have these conversations. And we have to, and as I've said, you know, I'm just the BSA administrator in the Financial Intelligence Unit. I'm not the head of the U.S. delegation. But in every single one of these conversations that we have with international partners and with the delegation, what we've said is we're public servants. We take an oath to the Constitution and to protect American values and American people. I administer that constitutional oath to every single person who joins FinCEN. And that's reflected in our 2019 guidance, that we don't consider software development something that is not speech. You know, there are all kinds of exceptions if you're transmitting value, but we have to reflect U.S. values and constitutional protections, and that has to be factored into any implementation of guidance. And we're not going to go contrary to American values for that or American law. And so we need to have these conversations that are factoring that in, because this doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Like, the point of this technology is to embody personal sovereignty in ways that protect people with transparency, but also protect privacy.
That's great. I wish we had a whole nother half hour to talk, but I'm afraid we're at time and I don't want to hog the discussion. So thank you so much. And I hope you've all enjoyed this important discussion about important topics. Thanks, guys.
Likewise. Thank you. Great to see you all.
Hi, and welcome to today's conversation, Bitcoin, a view from Congress. Contrary to what we're hearing from many skeptics, Bitcoin is not unregulated, as Peter's panel on the current state of AML underscores. In addition to the work of the agencies, Congress has played an active role on issues related to Bitcoin. Hi, I'm Robin Weisman, and I am Senior Policy Counsel at Coin Center. For those of you who don't know, Coin Center is an independent, nonprofit advocacy organization focused on the public policy issues around decentralized cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. We do not represent anyone or any specific company, just the interests of the technology itself and its availability to individual users whose lives it can improve. Our mission is to build a better understanding of these technologies and to promote a regulatory climate that helps policymakers meet their ends while preserving the freedom to innovate using blockchain technologies. We do this by educating policymakers about blockchain technology, producing and publishing policy research from respected academics and experts, and by engaging in advocacy. In addition to the agencies involved, we work with members of Congress and their staff to help develop legislative solutions to areas where existing laws could use greater clarity. And today, we're joined by three of the leading staff on our issues, and they are a bipartisan, bicameral group whose bosses sit on three key congressional committees. So I'm pleased to welcome Paul Balzano, who's a senior professional staff member to the House Agriculture Committee, which oversees the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission. We also have with us Bill Rockwood, who's counsel to Representative Darren Soto, who sits on the House Energy and Commerce Committee and is a co-chair of the Congressional Blockchain Caucus. Bill is also executive director of the Future Forum, a caucus comprised of young members of Congress focused on the issues affecting and of interest to younger Americans. And last but finally not least, we have Landon Zinda, who's counsel to the Senate Banking Committee. And prior to that, he was legislative director to Representative Tom Emmer. A lot of the issues that legislators and policymakers struggle with is how existing financial services regimes apply to this emerging area. What gaps exist and how to close those gaps is needed. And this work generally falls into the following areas. One, asset clarity for smooth and functioning markets. Two, consumer and investor protection. Three, clarity around tax treatment. And four, promoting innovation. It's such a privilege to be joined by the three of you today. And I think a great place to start this conversation would be for each of you to provide a brief overview of the work that you've been doing in this area. So I think with that, I'll kick it over to Paul to give us a little overview of what you've been working on.
Well, thanks, Robin. I appreciate it, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here. So at the House Agriculture Committee, we've been working on a few things. Maybe first is trying to help people understand why the Agriculture Committee is talking about Bitcoin. And it flows from, as you mentioned, our jurisdiction of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and their jurisdiction over commodity markets. And Bitcoin's a commodity, and so we spend a lot of time thinking about how the commission oversees these new and emerging markets. As we do that, I think one of the things we're thinking a lot about is market integrity and how do we make sure that spot markets and the places where people buy and sell Bitcoin and other digital assets, digital commodities are safe, and how to protect customers who are trading and buying and selling there. And then importantly, how to promote innovation. Last Congress, we had several members that worked together to produce a bill called the Digital Commodity Exchange Act, which would have created a framework for the regulation of certain spot markets. And this year, our work continues to get feedback on that bill and to think about ways in which we can promote the ideas around that bill of protecting customers, promoting innovation, and as you mentioned, trying to find clarity around asset types. Thanks.
Excellent. Bill, over to you.
Thanks, Robin. I'm Bill Rockwood, and I work for Congressman Darren Soto, and he is one of the co-chairs of the Congressional Blockchain Caucus. So I'll first mention some of the work of the Blockchain Caucus and then what our individual office is doing. The Blockchain Caucus is a group of about 25 members, a bipartisan group of members that are interested in the technology generally. And it's important for folks out there to know because it's largely an educational body. They believe in the technology generally and want greater understanding and adoption in Congress, but it's really just to help educate members of Congress that are both curious or to push the conversation forward on the policy front. So, and then some of the individual work our office is doing, again, focuses around individual or clarity of digital assets. And I'm happy to announce that 2 of our bills passed the House of Representatives earlier this year, the Digital Taxonomy Act and the Blockchain Innovation Act. These are both study bills because we're still in a learning phase with a lot of this stuff, both on the agency and congressional side. So they ask for the agencies to give their recommendations on both the current state of regulation and if anything or additional resources are needed. And finally, just as kind of a secret sauce that a lot of folks may not pay attention to is the role of Congress in its appropriations process. So I wanted to flag one specific thing we helped get passed was to help urge the IRS to update their crypto guidance. So there's also a role that Congress can help urge agencies through budget or other actions.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, I mean, I think the oversight function of Congress and sort of how that plays out through the legislative process could be something we talk about a little bit in the back half of this session. So Landon, would you like to talk about what you're working on in the Senate?
Sure. Thank you to the hosts and Robin for having me. Thank you to Queen's Senator. I work for Senator Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania. I am on the Senate Wi-Fi, so I am not always going to be very clear, but hopefully I will come back and be clear. He is the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee, and the Banking Committee has jurisdiction over banks, surprisingly, securities, and other issues related to cryptocurrencies. Prior to that, I worked for Tom Emmer from Minnesota, who's also a Blockchain Caucus co-chair, and worked on a number of his bills related to cryptocurrency as well. Since I have been here, Senator Toomey has sent a letter to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, as well as the U.S. Treasury, talking about the recent FinCEN rule related to self-hosted wallets, as well as the Financial Action Task Force guidance related to the same issue, as well as DeFi and potential issues related to non-custodial use of cryptocurrency services. That letter expressed concern with a number of those provisions and urged updating and revised guidance, and also expressed some of the concerns related to non-custodial services and having to potentially have those services be registered as money service businesses in the United States.
That was a very helpful letter, and so we thank you for your boss's leadership on that. Just as a follow-up to that, one bill that Coin Center is a big priority for us and that Representative Emmer worked on, and I believe also Representative Soto was supportive of many times, is the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act that would provide a safe harbor from state money transmission licensing requirements for non-custodial entities in the cryptocurrency space. Landon, do you want to start maybe and talk about why that's important? And then Bill, if you want to add anything, chime in.
Sure, so you summarized it briefly pretty well. It is the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act, and it's based on a foundation and the idea that if you are a service provider in the cryptocurrency space, but you never ever take control of anyone else's crypto or never have the ability to control it, you should not have to register as a state money transmitter, because in fact those laws are there to protect consumers who give up control of their assets for a period in order to transfer them. So if you never take control of the cryptocurrency of another's, you should not have to register as a money service business.
Yeah, so I think that's just important for folks to know that that's out there. It hasn't been reintroduced this year, but it's something that's been introduced in prior Congresses, and we may see again. I don't know, Bill, if you want to if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, we were just happy to support and make it a bipartisan effort. I think that's always important to highlight in Congress. So we made it a bipartisan bill, and we were curious for what it does, or wanted to be supportive for what it does, and also the idea of good faith, that if people are acting in good faith, then if the rules change down the road, they shouldn't be punished for it.
Yeah, clarity around that is always a really important thing to achieve. So now I'd like to move really from that. That was a really great background of the kinds of things you guys are working on, and hopefully gave our audience here today a flavor of the kinds of things that we interact over and that you're thinking about. But taking a more general approach, I'd just like to have a basic general conversation about the issues that I think might be of interest to our audience today. So I'm just going to start off with a sort of big picture question. How do you guys think that members in Congress think about Bitcoin versus other cryptocurrencies? Do you think that that's a distinction that's widely understood? Okay.
Yeah, sure. I'll start. I think there's always the opportunity to do more education. There's certainly, if you watch some of the hearings, there's a wide level of understanding. But we have a number of members, certainly the members in the blockchain caucus, that are very clear on the difference and have a really good grasp of the wide variety of assets that are out there.
Yeah, I think it varies a lot member to member. There are a couple of great advocacy organizations that are bringing awareness to Bitcoin and other issues on the Hill. Unfortunately, I think it was Facebook that largely did a lot to create the distinction between Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And that conversation on the Hill was 10 years after Bitcoin was created. So we're still very much catching up on a lot of these issues, but members are finally beginning to understand that Bitcoin is a open public network, that it is censorship resistant, and when you see other iterations being controlled by other entities, the distinction is very clear for some members.
And I'll jump on and completely agree with both of those, and add that Bitcoin is always, or traditionally, the starting point for any member of Congress. There's usually a news story or an interest in that subject, and whatever it may be, that the conversation starts at Bitcoin. A lot of times it'll be in the news, and a member will ask their staffer to, I need to know more about this. It sounds interesting, or it scares me for whatever reason. So I think a lot of us are sort of those points of contact that help facilitate those starting conversations. And it's really to help make sure that there is a distinction between these different types of assets. I think when some stories are in the news, there's a lot of conflation that all these things are the same, that Bitcoin and energy, or Bitcoin and another crypto get conflated. So a lot of our job is just starting the conversation and making sure these nuances are added as these questions are being asked.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say that it's a little bit of a skewed view given the three of you that I have here today, because obviously you and your bosses are all very much aware of the distinction, and we've worked really closely with a lot of you to help make sure others understand it. But Landon, I think you're exactly right. Sometimes the distinction between Bitcoin and other types of digital assets comes when there's a conversation about another type of digital asset. And that also brings a lot of scrutiny, I think, to assets like Bitcoin as part of that conversation. So the conversation doesn't always start out about Bitcoin, but sometimes it ends up being about Bitcoin. And so that's an important distinction to make. And that actually leads me into another thing that I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on, which is that I think a lot of people, Bill, you mentioned the news and how news stories tend to drive legislative interest sometimes. It seems like there's been a big surge in the interest in cryptocurrencies lately on Capitol Hill. And it also coincides with a big price run up and a big price fall. Do you think that, and that's happened in the past, do you think that there's a correlation between Congress sort of focusing their attention on these issues and the price? And I guess I'm looking at you, Bill, since you started the conversation.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard to ignore when, it took 10 years for the market cap of all crypto to get to $1 trillion, and then it went to $2 trillion in less than 6 months. So I think that's certainly a driving force, that it was much more well known. You get famous people tweeting about it, and that drives some interest, and you get both positive and negative stories that I think there was interest in the big run up, and there were some tweets about crypto and energy and money laundering, and sometimes the conversation doesn't always start in a great place. But I think if I were to say 2-3 years ago, we had to kind of start these conversations ourselves, whereas in the last year, people are coming to us and asking these questions. So I think there is a sea change in this kind of second big run up in price.
Oh, that's an interesting perspective. I don't know if Landon or Paul, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I definitely have noticed that more people come up to us and let us know where Bitcoin is at that day. I think the broader acceptance will happen on the Hill and in Congress when we're not necessarily watching that price every single day, when we kind of realize that Bitcoin is this first open public network that is there and that doesn't need the government's permission to grow. That's kind of a second level where, day-to-day prices may not matter as much.
Yeah, for sure. And then Paul, if you have anything there.
No, I mean, I think that's right. At some point we're going to treat Bitcoin as not being novel, and it'll be a thing that's there that people use, and we don't check the price every day, and that'll be the day that it is, I guess, fully accepted.
Yeah, well, it'll be curious to see when that day finally comes.
Someday. Yeah.
someday. And this is a little bit of a funny question, because for all of you, it's clearly something that you think about every day. But how do you think that Bitcoin policy fits into sort of the larger legislative priorities, both within your offices and then also sort of in Congress in general?
I'll start on that one. So I think for us, and certainly for the committee and our committee members, we have this jurisdiction over a financial market regulator, and where we start is really about the people who use those markets and the constituents that our members represent, right? And so I think where our members start when we think about things like Bitcoin is who's using it, why are they using it, to the extent that bad things are happening to them, how do we keep them safe, and how do we ensure that we have market integrity, right? So ultimately, at the committee, we talk about market integrity and we talk about customer protection. Those are probably the two big things we think about when we talk about any marketplace, so futures, derivative markets, but then also as we talk about Bitcoin as well. And so starting from there, then we think about what are the rules that we can put in place to try to make sure that we promote market integrity, we promote customer protection, and then I guess also obviously innovation. That's the other thing I think in the Bitcoin space, right? That we think a lot about. How do we make sure that there are safe places for people to trade where they won't be taken advantage of? How do we make sure that people who want to do innovative things are able to do those things and able to engage in economic activity that may be novel, but is important to them and can be important to the wider economy? That's where we start. And, I think Bitcoin fits nicely into that conversation. And, we try to drive the conversation and think about those things as we think about how to make sure we enact policies that promote that.
I just wanted to say briefly, like on the Senate Banking Committee, and especially for Republicans, capital formation and the concerns about maintaining private transactions, guarding people's privacy are two important aspects that Bitcoin also very well fits into. And when you have something that is free of government control and that you don't need approval from the government to transact in, that's going to capital formation and support Bitcoin. Now back to Bill.
And yeah, I think Bitcoin is a great use case that a lot of the initial questions we get, Bitcoin tends to handle very well. Like Landon mentioned privacy, and there are a lot of misconceptions, and it's sometimes those are the best questions to be asked is a misunderstanding of something in crypto, and then having an example of like, well, actually Bitcoin is highly secure and is metal proof, and you can't alter the ledger once it happens. That sometimes misconceptions are actually great starting points for conversation here. Educationally, they're tough sometimes, but I think we're all looking to strike that balance. And sometimes when people first hear about this stuff on the government side, there might be a tendency to want to overregulate or do too much too fast. And it's always striking the balance of making sure we have that regulatory clarity, that market integrity, but don't over-regulate in a way that harms innovations and things like Bitcoin from being created in the first place.
Yeah, I think those are all really insightful points, and obviously highlights why we're super glad that you guys are all working on these issues. But actually, Paul, you said something that made me think of another thought, which is I put innovation as the fourth kind of category, but innovation really underpins everything here. Like, I mean, you have all the categories of of markets and consumer investor protection, and then tax, but really innovation is the idea here. And so when you're thinking about that balancing test, I guess can you guys talk a little bit about how your policies are driven by the innovation part of the equation, as well as the sort of consumer protection part of the equation, and if those two things are at odds, or if they might be complementary?
So I don't necessarily think that they're at odds, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're talking about customer protection because we're talking about innovation, right? Like people are doing innovative things, and that is a good thing. And we want people to be able to continue to do that. And I think, especially in the crypto space, where I don't want to pick on anything particular, right? But there's been fraud and bad actors that have happened, the same as have happened in financial markets forever. But when you have those things, right, you chase people out of marketplaces and you chase people away from innovation because they get harmed. And so trying to make sure that we create rules that permit innovative activity to happen and give folks especially when it comes to intermediaries, right? I think that's what we think about at the committee is those intermediaries that stand and take customer assets and stand between people during trades. How do we make sure that those entities, those third parties, are good, capable actors that aren't taking advantage of people? And so we're talking about that because people are being innovative, and to me, they're really two sides of the same coin,
so to speak.
Yeah. Didn't mean it that way, but yes.
Oh, it's good. Yeah. I don't know if Landon or Bill, you want to jump in on that. If not, we can move on to something else.
Go for it, Landon.
I don't know much. I mean, Robin, you do bring up a great point. In the context of Bitcoin, we're not going to stop it. The innovation is here. And I think you make a good point that innovation can lead to increased consumer protection, and we can find new ways to make sure people retain their assets and have control over them. So Bitcoin is one of the best examples of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think those are great points, that it is a balance, and I think that's what excites us all in working in a bipartisan way on all these issues, that one of the statistics we often use in our office to communicate the need for clarity is that a lot of these startups in the blockchain space spend up to 50% of their startup costs on legal fees, just because the lines of compliance are a little ambiguous. So if you were to apply that to things like Bitcoin, I think it's hard to say that those would even exist. And that when you clarify those things, kind of as Paul mentioned, when you have the rules for the road, it drives out some of that Wild West mindset. So I think you can promote innovation in finding the right balance of regulatory clarity, if we do it in a thoughtful and prudent way.
For sure. So we're almost toward the end of our time, and I thought a good way to end would be sort of on a lightning round. I know that's everybody's favorite term. About one thing either for our audience to be keeping an eye on, or one thing that you're keeping an eye on in this space as a closing thought. So I'm going to start with Paul, and then go to Bill, and then Landon to wrap it up.
Sure. I think one thing I'm paying attention to is spot market regulation. We've heard from Chairman Gensler. We've heard from a number of senators who've started to weigh in, and certainly our committee has its own views around these new intermediaries that are growing up around that are trading venues for crypto and Bitcoin. Those entities have a regulatory environment today. They are regulated today. They have a complex regulatory environment. And I think there is plenty of interest in Congress in our case, maybe making that a little bit easier or a little more coherent, I guess. And in other folks' case, maybe making it a little bit tougher. And just that is an issue that I think is going to be a bigger issue this year and into next.
Yeah, I think you see that the issue of spot market regulation coming into the dialogue from a lot of different ways. So I think that's definitely something to be keeping our eyes on.
Yeah.
Bill?
Yeah, I guess just the themes and the tone of the conversation generally, that I think if you look at crypto Twitter or, the things that make the news in Congress, there's still a very large divide between those that are very educated in the space and those that are new. So I think just hearing what the average conversation on the street is, and the tone and the tenor, and how these things continue to be framed. And I guess just one piece of advice, because, Bitcoin is only, 11, 12 years old at this point, that just when somebody asks about these things for the first time, even if it's a question that you might roll your eyes at or something you dealt with 10 years ago, if that's the point that person is starting the conversation, I think they're asking you about, even if, it may be a project or a coin you can roll your eyes at. It's a great time to mention things like Bitcoin and well-established things that, I think this is a time of collaboration where this industry has been defined by, rogue innovators. But I think we're far enough in the conversation where we need to start to collaborate and find ways to work together to continue this evolutionary process.
I think that's a good thought. Landon?
If this is my last chance to speak, I'll do 3 things on the lightning round real quick. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Robin for hosting. Please engage with us. We can't learn about things if we don't know about them. We do about them. Your senator, your representative, show them what you're doing and what's cool about it. And then the actual lightning round part about what you should keep an eye on going forward. I want to give a shout out to Representative Anthony Gonzalez from Ohio, who was probably the first member to put in the congressional record the term decentralized finance. So DeFi is finally on the minds of Congress, and I think will be a bigger conversation going forward.
I think that's a really good point to end on. And I just want to thank the 3 of you so much again for taking the time. And I think as our audience would know, if they managed to make it through our session, we have some really great minds thinking about this in Congress and supporting the efforts of the members of Congress there. And we're very thankful for your work. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.